Let's talk about silence, not as passivity, but as the most active form of resistance you can choose in the face of psychological manipulation. Specifically, in the context of narcissistic dynamics, silence is not retreat. It is a weapon, a scalpel. It cuts straight to the core of the narcissist's illusion. And it does so without you lifting a single emotional finger. Narcissists, by their very nature, are addicted to attention. And I don't mean that in the shallow, surface-level sense of social media likes or applause, although that's part of it. I'm talking about a deeper existential dependency on external validation to patch over the internal void. A narcissist is a person who has constructed their entire identity around performance, around image, around reaction. They need to provoke you positively or negatively because reaction is the proof of control, and control is the currency of their fragile self-worth. So what happens when you stop giving it to them? What happens when the audience leaves the theater? The curtain falls, the performance collapses. And here's the uncomfortable truth for them. They are nothing without an audience. Your silence strips them of the role they were so desperately trying to play. It exposes the hollowness behind the mask. There's no one left to convince, no one left to charm, no one left to gaslight, manipulate, or guilt into submission. And that terrifies them. You see, silence is not absence. It's presence, the kind of presence that forces the other person to confront themselves. Because when you stop feeding them your energy, your reactions, your confusion, your hope for resolution, they're left with the only thing they were trying to avoid the entire time, themselves. Let me make this clear. A narcissist isn't afraid of you yelling. They aren't afraid of your anger. They expect it. In fact, they provoke it because your emotional outburst serves them. It validates their sense of significance. If they can make you explode, then they still matter. They still have power. But silence? Silence is rejection of the game entirely. It's you stepping off the chessboard. It's you saying, I no longer accept the rules. I don't even acknowledge this as a game worth playing. And now they're left sitting at a table, moving pieces alone, arguing with ghosts. Here's where the psychological depth comes in. You're not just removing your voice. You're reclaiming your sovereignty. You're reestablishing that your value is not tied to their approval, nor is your identity defined by the role they tried to cast you in. And that, psychologically speaking, is a death blow to the narcissistic construct, because you're not giving them something to fight. You're not even giving them something to fix. You're giving them nothing, and nothing, paradoxically, is the one thing they can't spin. They can't weaponize your silence. They can't distort it in front of others in the same way they can twist your words or your emotional reactions. Silence robs them of their leverage. It steals their narrative. And most importantly, it introduces a reality that they can't control: ambiguity. Narcissists need clarity, but not in the way healthy people do. They want to control the narrative. They want to be the one who discards you, who ends the story on their terms. So when you choose silence, especially after enduring their manipulation, you rob them of that final word. You don't just end the conversation. You erase the possibility of one. You don't slam the door. You don't slam the door. You disappear from the room, and they don't even know which door you walked through. Now, of course, this is hard, especially if you're someone who values connection, truth, understanding. If you're empathic, silence can feel unnatural, like a betrayal of your own moral compass. But this is where the deeper transformation begins, when you recognize that silence isn't abandonment of truth, it's a declaration of it. A refusal to continue explaining your humanity to someone committed to misunderstanding it. And here's the deeper philosophical insight. Not every battle requires words. Some battles are won by simply refusing to fight on enemy terms. Some victories are quiet, still, resolute. And in that silence is dignity, not pride, not ego, the rooted awareness that your presence alone has weight, and you will no longer offer it to people who traded manipulation. So if you've gone silent, stay silent, not out of spite, but out of principle. not to punish, but to preserve. That stillness isn't emptiness, it's structure. It's you rebuilding yourself away from chaos. And eventually, mark my words, they will regret it. Maybe not today, maybe not outwardly. But narcissists always come back to the silence that exposed them, because it lingers, it haunts. It holds up a mirror they never asked to see. And when they realize they can't reach you anymore, not emotionally, not psychologically, that's when the regret sets in. Because they didn't lose someone they could control. They lost someone who finally understood their power. And that's what silence really is. The sound of you remembering who you are. Let's examine what happens when you consciously and without apology remove your emotional availability from a narcissist's reach. Because this act of quiet reclamation is not only psychologically devastating to them, it's also profoundly empowering for you. And if you understand why, truly grasp the dynamics at play, you'll never again underestimate the force of your inner detachment. It is a silent revolution. And it doesn't just change the game, it ends it. Now, understand this. Narcissists don't just feed on attention, they feed on access. Emotional access, psychological access. They want into your world, your mind, your sense of self. Not because they love you, not because they understand you, but because they see your emotional presence as a resource, a faucet, something they can turn on and off to regulate their own sense of control. And the second you start pulling that access away, not in a theatrical way, but in a steady, quiet, unshakable way, they begin to panic. Because the machine they've built only works if you're still plugged into it. This is where the dynamic gets interesting. Narcissists are not afraid of rejection in the ordinary sense. In fact, many of them expect to be disliked. What they fear profoundly is indifference. Rejection implies you still care enough to oppose them. Indifference, however, true detachment, tells them you've transcended their relevance altogether. You've moved on. You've woken up. You've stopped playing. And that's when the narcissistic wound bleeds the most. Not when you criticize them, not when you confront them, but when you disengage. When your presence no longer revolves around their drama, their chaos, their narrative. When your silence isn't just silence, it's emotional closure. That's what makes them spiral. Because now they're no longer in control, and they know they can't win you back with the same old tricks. You see, to a narcissist, your emotional responses, your highs and lows, your pleas, your explanations, these are currency. These are currency. Every time you try to reason with them, justify yourself, or beg to be understood, you're giving them data. You're giving them power. You're showing them where your boundaries still leak, where your soul still hopes for something they have no intention of giving. But when you become unresponsive, not cold but solid, something fundamental shifts. You become unpredictable. You're no longer a predictable reaction machine. You're no longer driven by the compulsive need to explain your worth to someone who profits from your self-doubt. And now they don't know how to control you anymore. That's a death sentence for a narcissist's illusion of dominance. What you need to realize here is that emotional unavailability is not cruelty, it's protection. It's protection. It's the recognition that not every relationship deserves your vulnerability. That not every person has earned the right to know how you feel. And sometimes the most compassionate thing you can do for yourself is to become psychologically untouchable to those who repeatedly violate your trust. This kind of emotional disengagement is deeply misunderstood. We're often conditioned to think that being empathic means being endlessly open, endlessly forgiving, endlessly available. But that's not empathy, that's martyrdom. And it's not noble, it's self-destructive. Because empathy without discernment is a liability. It leaves you wide open to people who view your compassion not as a gift, but as an opportunity. So when you begin to close that emotional gate, not with malice, but with wisdom, you're no longer feeding the narcissist's need to feel important. You're no longer letting them use your emotional presence as a mirror for their inflated self-image. You are, in essence, reclaiming your narrative. You are saying, I do not exist to complete your story. And what's most painful for the narcissist isn't your silence. It's the absence of control that your silence represents. It's the final, undeniable truth that they have lost access to your inner world, that they can no longer provoke, charm, manipulate, or confuse their way back in. And the more they try, because they will try, the more deafening your lack of response becomes. Because silence in this context is not passive. It is loud. It screams. You no longer matter in the way you used to. And that realization is a blow their ego simply cannot metabolize. So I want you to understand this deeply. When you remove your emotional availability, you are not abandoning your humanity. You are honoring it. You are stepping into a higher level of self-respect. One that no longer requires validation from people who exploit your openness. One that doesn't negotiate its worth. One that simply walks away, calm, clear, and unconcerned with whether or not the narcissist ever gets it. Because that's the truth they can't bear to face, that you don't need them to understand. You don't need closure. You don't even need acknowledgement. You've already closed the chapter, and they weren't invited to the ending. The narcissist regrets your silence not because it hurts them, but because it proves they never had the power they thought they did. Let's talk about the narcissist's greatest addiction, control. But not just any control. Control over your narrative. Control over your emotions, your decisions, your sense of self-worth. And what breaks that addiction faster than anything else isn't confrontation. It isn't revenge. It's silence. It's silence. But not silence as in avoidance. Not silence as in fear. I'm talking about intentional silence, the kind rooted in clarity, discipline, and personal power. See, narcissists operate in a very specific psychological framework. They believe that if they can manipulate the meaning of events, if they can twist the story, you'll remain in orbit around them. You'll keep reacting, keep explaining, keep proving yourself. That's what they want. They thrive in environments where the emotional energy is high and chaotic. Because in that chaos, they can rewrite the rules. They can shift blame. They can paint themselves as the victim while subtly portraying you as the unstable one. But what happens when you stop playing? What happens when you choose silence, not because you're defeated, but because you've stepped outside their frame altogether? You remove the very oxygen that feeds their control. They can no longer shape your story if you stop giving them new material to twist. When you stop responding, when you stop defending yourself against lies or guilt trips or gaslighting, they lose their grip on the narrative. And they hate that desperately. Now, let's go a level deeper. This isn't just about external manipulation. Narcissists are masters at internal colonization. Internal colonization. They want to rent space in your mind. They want you rehearsing their criticisms, ruminating over their approval, constantly scanning for signs of their validation or disapproval. They want you to live with their voice as the narrator in your head. In your head. And the only way to truly evict that voice is through inner silence, through refusing to let their perceptions define your identity. This is where things get philosophical. Because what we're really talking about is sovereignty, psychological sovereignty. Psychological sovereignty. The refusal to let someone else's dysfunction shape your reality. And you don't reclaim that sovereignty through shouting or arguing. You reclaim it through discernment, through learning when to speak and when not to. When to engage, and when to walk away. Here's the thing, when you go silent, you force the narcissist to confront the one thing they avoid at all costs themselves. As long as you're reacting, they can distract themselves with your energy. But when you remove that energy, all they're left with is their own emptiness. Their own unresolved wounds. Their own lack of identity outside of control. And that's a mirror they cannot tolerate. So they'll provoke, they'll test, they'll bait you. They'll push boundaries just to get a reaction. Because any reaction, positive or negative, reaffirms that they still matter in your world. But if you stay grounded, if you stay committed to your silence, not out of spite, but out of self-respect, something incredible happens. Their control starts to crack. Their influence begins to fade. And for the first time, they realize they don't get to write your story anymore. This is why silence is so psychologically powerful. It's not just the absence of words, it's the presence of clarity, of boundaries, of a deep internal shift that says, I no longer need you to validate my truth. It's the quiet conviction that you've already won, not by destroying them, but by refusing to be destroyed. And look, this isn't easy. Silence is not for the weak, it's for the strong. It's for the ones who are willing to feel the discomfort of withdrawal, the ones who understand that healing often requires a period of sacred solitude. Because when you go silent, you're not just cutting them off, you're reorienting your entire psyche. You're teaching your nervous system that chaos is not normal, that peace is not boring, that stillness is not weakness. You're reclaiming the internal space that was once hijacked by their dysfunction, and you're filling it with purpose, with clarity, with dignity. And that's what makes them regret losing you. Not because of who you were when they had access to you, but because of who you've become in the silence they can no longer penetrate. It's important to realize that this kind of silence isn't about punishment. It's about preservation. It's a spiritual discipline, a boundary encoded into behavior, and it communicates more than words ever could. I am no longer available to be misused. So if you're wrestling with the guilt of going silent, let me tell you, don't. There's no guilt in choosing peace over drama. There's no guilt in protecting your mind from narratives that were never yours to carry. Your silence is not a void. It's a declaration, a reset, a free space in which you get to rebuild without the noise of manipulation clouding your vision. And that right there is what makes narcissists regret everything. Not the silence itself, but the strength it reveals. Let's talk about something most people don't quite understand: emotional neutrality. Not indifference, not apathy, but true neutrality. A poised, deliberate refusal to be emotionally hijacked. And when it comes to dealing with narcissists, this one shift in posture dismantles their psychological leverage almost entirely. See, narcissists are emotional puppeteers. They specialize in one thing above all else: provoking a reaction. It doesn't matter what kind. Rage, guilt, confusion, anxiety. If it's emotional, they can use it. Because emotional reactivity is currency in the narcissist's economy. It means they still matter. It means they still have control. But when you stay neutral, truly, internally calm, it scrambles the narcissist's operating system. They don't know what to do with a person who doesn't respond to provocation the way they expect. It's like trying to manipulate a mirror that doesn't reflect. And the reason this is so devastating to them is because emotional neutrality deprives them of feedback. Without feedback, they can't adjust their tactics. Without tactics, they lose control. Without control, they feel powerless. And remember, for a narcissist, powerlessness is existential terror. Now, don't confuse neutrality with suppression. This isn't about burying your emotions or pretending they're not there. That's repression. And repression always leaks out sideways. No, what I'm talking about is awareness without entanglement. Feeling the rise of emotion, anger, disappointment, fear, and choosing not to let it dictate your behavior. That's maturity. That's sovereignty. That's self-command. And it takes real psychological training. Most people aren't trained for this. Most people are conditioned to react. Someone insults them, they defend. Someone lies, they try to correct the story. Someone triangulates, they scramble to prove their side. It's automatic. It's nervous system driven. But that's exactly why narcissists have such an easy time destabilizing people. They understand that most people have never taken command of their nervous system. Most people live in reaction. But neutrality breaks the loop. It's the moment you say, I no longer dance to your rhythm. I set my own. It's the decision to walk away from the drama. Not because you're weak, but because your energy is too sacred to waste. It's the confidence that says, you don't get to dictate the tempo of my emotions anymore. And when that shift happens, you move out of their gravitational field. You stop being a character in their chaos and start becoming the author of your own narrative. And it's not just that the narcissist loses power over you, it's that they become painfully aware of that loss. Because for someone built on ego and domination, nothing is more wounding than irrelevance. And neutrality says, without words, you're no longer significant enough to warrant my reaction. That cuts deeper than any insult. That hurts more than any counterattack. Because it tells the narcissist that their ability to provoke, to matter, to dominate, that it's dead. Gone. Finished. And it was you who ended it. Silently. Now this takes discipline. It takes self-respect. Because in the beginning, everything in you will want to react. You'll want to defend yourself, explain yourself, reclaim your name. But every time you react, you hand over authority. You say, you still get to set the terms. Yeah. But when you stay composed, even in the face of smears, lies, emotional sabotage, you send a different message. You are not worth destabilizing myself for. And over time, this kind of calm becomes its own form of power. People notice. The narcissist notices, and most importantly, you notice. You begin to feel it in your bones, that you don't have to explain yourself to be valid. That peace isn't something they can take. It's something you protect. It's something you protect, that your emotional world is your domain, not theirs. And once you taste that kind of autonomy, you'll never give it up again. This, by the way, is the deeper victory. Not just breaking contact, not just ending the relationship, but becoming the kind of person who can no longer be controlled in the first place. And that only happens through self-mastery. Through learning how to stand in the storm without flinching. Through learning how to feel without folding. And that's what neutrality really is. It's inner structure, psychological architecture, a soul with a spine. So if you want to make a narcissist regret losing you, stop trying to hurt them back. That's still a game they understand. Instead, rise. Stabilize. Remove your emotional supply. Watch their power collapse in the vacuum you leave behind. Because when you stop playing the game, the board disappears. And that's the one thing they can't survive, a game that no longer exists. Final thought, when your silence is anchored in neutrality, not resentment, you don't just starve the narcissist. You free yourself. And there is no revenge greater than a freedom they can no longer touch. Let's examine something many people overlook when dealing with narcissists, the concept of unpredictability, psychological unpredictability. The ability to move in ways they cannot anticipate. This isn't manipulation, and it's not deception. It's rooted in something deeper, autonomy, sovereignty, a refusal to conform to the emotional scripts narcissists try to impose on you. See, narcissists operate in patterns. They rely on predictability. Their power hinges on your consistency, your tendency to seek closure, to defend yourself, to chase, to react. Because when you're predictable, they know which button to press and exactly when to press it. What most people don't realize is that narcissistic abuse isn't sustained through sheer force. It's sustained through psychological loops, cycles of push and pull, idealize and devalue, provoke and reward. These loops only work when the target becomes emotionally conditioned to play along. So the narcissist creates a pattern, insult you, then withdraw affection. You react, defensive, angry, hurt, and the cycle repeats. You've been baited, hooked, predictable. But the moment you interrupt that pattern, not with rage, not with drama, but with calm and predictability, you disorient them. You remove the map they've been using to navigate and dominate your psychology. Suddenly, you don't text back. You don't explain yourself. You don't chase the apology. You don't react to their silence or their rage. And just like that, the entire system malfunctions. Why does this matter so much? Because narcissists depend on knowing how you'll behave. They exploit the rhythm of your emotions. Your patterns become their footholds. But unpredictability is like cutting the ropes in a puppet show. It doesn't just confuse them. It terrifies them. Because they're not adaptable in the way healthy individuals are. They're rigid. Pathologically so. Their control systems only work within narrow frameworks. And when you violate those frameworks, you shatter their illusion of superiority. But let's go even deeper. Let's go even deeper. Why do you become predictable in the first place? Because you were conditioned likely from early life to seek harmony, to resolve tension, to earn the love, to keep the peace, to fix what's broken. That's empathy weaponized against you. Narcissists see that reflex and they exploit it. They know if they withhold affection, you'll chase it. If they accuse you, you'll defend. If they discard you, you'll beg to understand why. That's the pattern. That's the loop. And that's why unpredictability is so powerful. Because it's not just confusing for the narcissist, it's healing for you. It's a way of reclaiming your psychological space. Your right to not react. Your right to not explain. Your right to choose your next move from a place of intention, not trauma. When you become unpredictable, you stop living reactively and start living consciously. That's the shift. That's what breaks the cycle. Because unpredictability isn't about chaos, it's about freedom. It's about freedom. The freedom to not be emotionally available on demand. The freedom to walk away mid-sentence if the conversation becomes abusive. The freedom to not rise to the bait when they insult you. The freedom to not reply to the late-night text or answer the call designed to reel you back in. It's the quiet declaration. I belong to myself now. But here's the part that most people miss. Your unpredictability must be rooted in consistency. That sounds paradoxical, but it's not. Your unpredictability isn't random. It flows from a deeper principle, commitment to self-respect, a refusal to participate in dysfunction. That's the consistent part. Your values, your boundaries. But the way those values express themselves, that's where unpredictability becomes a weapon of psychological clarity. Sometimes you go silent. Sometimes you speak with piercing directness. Sometimes you disengage completely. The narcissist never knows what's coming because you're no longer playing a role. They're no longer the director of your script, and that scares them. It exposes something they've spent their entire lives trying to hide, their dependence on control. Narcissists don't feel secure in relationships. They don't trust people to stay unless they're manipulated into staying. So when you become unpredictable, they interpret it as loss, not just of control, but of importance. Because now your attention isn't guaranteed. Your energy isn't on tap. Your emotional availability isn't a given. You become scarce, and in the narcissist's mind, scarcity equals power. Now, let me be clear. This is not about becoming cold or cruel. This is not about playing games. This is about stepping out of their game entirely. It's about becoming so stable in your identity that you don't need to broadcast your worth or fight to be seen. Your silence says it all. Your unpredictability says, I am no longer under your spell. I am no longer emotionally entangled. I've upgraded my operating system, and they feel that deeply. They feel the loss of access, the loss of control, the absence of reaction, and that's what they regret. Not because they loved you in the true sense, but because you were a source of supply, and now you're not. Because you're unpredictable, and they can't build a strategy around you anymore. So if you want to truly disarm a narcissist, don't scream, don't explain. Don't play the chess game of emotional warfare. Just become unpredictable, grounded in your values, but elusive in your reaction. They won't know whether to love bomb, smear, ghost, or plead. And eventually, they'll give up. Because unpredictability isn't just silence, it's psychological emancipation. When your actions become unreadable to the manipulator, you stop being a pawn and start becoming a force. That's not just silence, that's strategy. And it's what turns regret into reality for them and liberation for you. Let's talk about something that doesn't get enough attention. The idea that silence itself is a declaration of war to the narcissist. Not a war waged with violence or vengeance, but with dignity, with restraint, with the refusal to play their game. Because when you go silent, truly silent, not out of fear or avoidance, but from clarity and sovereignty, you're doing something profound. You're denying the narcissist what they crave most, not your love, not your validation, not even your presence. What they truly crave is access. Access to your attention, access to your mind, access to your emotional responses, which they can manipulate like the strings on a marionette. Your silence is the severing of those strings. That's why they spiral when you go quiet. That's why they provoke, triangulate, spread rumors, and send flying monkeys to do their dirty work. Because when they can't reach you directly, they'll reach sideways. They'll scratch and claw for any fragment of your energy. But when you don't flinch, when your silence is steady and not laced with passive aggression or veiled guilt, they realize something chilling to them. You're no longer under their psychological control. Now it's not just about going no contact. It's deeper than that. You can be in the same room with a narcissist and still be profoundly silent. This is the kind of silence that is not just about the absence of words. It's about the absence of submission. You've emotionally unplugged from their drama. You're not feeding the chaos with your defenses. And you're not trying to explain, not justify, or even prove that you've changed. You just are. And that presence, when it's rooted in stillness and strength, is deafening to someone who survives off control. See, narcissists are obsessed with narrative. They're constantly constructing a story in which they are the victim, the hero, the genius, the misunderstood one. And you, if you've escaped, become the villain. But here's the twist. Your silence ruins their narrative because they can say whatever they want. They can lie. They can dramatize. But when you don't respond, when you don't enter the ring to defend yourself, you rob their story of oxygen. You render it impotent. And more importantly, you prove something critical to them and to yourself. You are no longer defined by their version of you. That is an existential threat to someone who defines themselves through domination. When you stop participating in their script, they lose their sense of direction. Narcissists need mirrors to survive, and not just any mirrors, distorted ones. Ones that reflect them as grand, powerful, desirable, morally superior. But when you become a blank wall instead of a mirror, they can't project onto you anymore. That terrifies them because now they're forced to face what they've been running from all along, themselves. And what do they find when they look in that mirror? A hollow identity, a fragmented self, a person so disconnected from authentic emotion that they've outsourced their entire sense of worth to external control. That's the curse of the narcissist. Their identity isn't built, it's borrowed. It's constructed from manipulation, deceit, and the consumption of other people's attention. So when you deny them that attention, you're not just ignoring them, you're destabilizing the very scaffolding of their ego. But here's where it gets important for you. Because silence isn't just a tool to punish or protect. It's a practice, a discipline. It requires strength to not react, to not defend yourself when lies are told, to not chase closure that was never going to be offered in good faith. But that strength doesn't come from numbness. It comes from self-respect, from knowing your energy is sacred, your peace is earned, your attention is currency, and you're no longer going to spend it on someone who bankrupted your trust and tried to rewrite your story. Some people will say, oh, but doesn't silence make you look weak? No, not when it's anchored in integrity. There's a kind of silence that's laced with cowardice, sure, but that's not what we're talking about. We're talking about the silence that's born from wisdom. The silence of the warrior who knows which battles are worth fighting and which ones are traps. The silence that signals, I've seen enough, I've learned enough. And I choose to walk forward without engaging in the chaos I once mistook for connection. And what's more, your silence teaches others how to treat you. It sets a precedent. It says, I don't reward manipulation with explanation. I don't negotiate with emotional terrorists. I don't respond to provocations designed to bait me into submission. That's not arrogance. That's psychological sovereignty. And it's what the narcissist regrets most, not just losing you, but losing the ability to shape you. So here's the final thought I want to leave you with. Silence isn't the end of the conversation. It's the beginning of a new narrative. One where you are no longer the supporting character in someone else's delusion. One where your worth isn't tied to being understood by someone incapable of empathy. One where your voice when it does speak again, is no longer shaky, confused, or seeking permission. The silence that comes from clarity is louder than any scream. It is not retreat, it is revolution, and it is the sound of you reclaiming your life.